Emily Harris had always been a skeptic. As a historian specializing in medieval Britain, she often spent her time debunking myths and legends that surrounded ancient sites. So, when she inherited a small, Victorian terraced house on Bethel Street in Norwich from her late grandmother, she thought nothing of the whispered stories about its dark past. Ghosts, she believed, were nothing more than tales conjured up by overactive imaginations. The house itself was charming, albeit a bit outdated. Narrow, with creaky wooden floors and a stone facade, it was nestled between two other equally old buildings. Emily saw it as a perfect project, something to occupy her time and distract her from the grief of losing her grandmother. She decided to move in immediately. The first night in the house, Emily felt uneasy. The air inside was thick, almost oppressive, and there was a lingering smell of dampness that she couldn't quite place. She chalked it up to the house being old and closed up for years. After unpacking some essentials, she settled into bed, hoping for a good night's sleep. But sleep didn't come easily. The old house groaned and creaked as if it were alive. The wind outside whistled through the gaps in the window frames, creating an eerie, mournful sound. She could hear the faint ticking of an old grandfather clock from somewhere deep within the house, even though she hadn't seen one anywhere. Around 2 a.m., Emily was jolted awake by a loud thud. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding. The sound seemed to come from the hallway just outside her bedroom door. For a moment, she was frozen in fear, listening intently. There it was again, a soft, deliberate creak, like the sound of someone slowly walking across the floorboards. Her rational mind told her it was nothing, just the house settling or perhaps a draft. But the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She reached over and grabbed her phone, shining its light toward the door. The hallway beyond was pitch black, the shadows seeming to shift and move on their own. "Get a grip, Emily," she whispered to herself, trying to quell the rising panic. But something in her gut told her not to open that door, not to step out into the darkness. She decided to stay in bed, pulling the covers up to her chin, and eventually drifted into an uneasy sleep. Over the next few days, the unsettling occurrences continued. Objects in the house seemed to move on their own, keys she'd left on the kitchen table would mysteriously end up on the floor, cabinet doors that she knew she'd closed would be open when she returned to the room. There was always a chill in the air, no matter how many layers she wore or how high she turned up the heat. One evening, as she was researching some old documents related to the history of Norwich, she stumbled upon a reference to Bethel Street. In the late 1800s, a series of mysterious deaths had occurred in the very house she was now living in. All women, all living alone. The deaths were officially ruled as suicides, but local folklore suggested something more sinister, something about a malevolent presence, an evil spirit that drove its victims to madness. Emily felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead as she read further. The last death recorded was that of a young woman named Eliza Crawford, who had lived in the house in 1893. According to the records, she had been found hanging from the rafters in the attic, her face frozen in a mask of sheer terror. That night, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every creak, every groan of the old house seemed amplified, echoing in the silence. As she lay in bed, she thought she saw a shadow move across the wall, a tall, thin figure that seemed to linger just at the edge of her vision. The dread was suffocating, but she forced herself to dismiss it as nothing more than her imagination playing tricks on her after reading those old stories. A week later, Emily had a visitor. Her best friend, Sarah, came to stay for the weekend, hoping to lift Emily's spirits. The two of them had been inseparable since university, and Sarah was the one person who could always make Emily laugh, even in the darkest of times. On the first night, they sat in the living room, sharing a bottle of wine and reminiscing about old times. Emily felt a sense of relief with Sarah there, like a weight had been lifted off her chest. But as the night wore on, the atmosphere in the house seemed to change. The temperature dropped suddenly, and the lights began to flicker. Sarah frowned and looked around. "Is this place always so cold?" she asked, rubbing her arms. Emily shook her head, trying to laugh it off. "It's an old house, you know how it is." But Sarah wasn't convinced. "I don't know, there's something off about this place." Before Emily could respond, they both heard it, a low, guttural moan coming from the direction of the staircase. It was a sound unlike anything Emily had ever heard before, like a mix between a cry of pain and a deep, rumbling growl. The two women froze, their eyes wide with fear. The moan came again, louder this time, followed by a series of rapid, heavy footsteps on the stairs. "Someone's in the house," Sarah whispered, grabbing Emily's arm. Emily shook her head. "No, that's impossible. All the doors are locked." But the footsteps continued, getting closer, until they were right outside the living room door. The door itself began to rattle, as if someone, or something, was trying to force it open. In a moment of sheer panic, Emily grabbed a fireplace poker and stood in front of Sarah, ready to defend her friend from whatever was on the other side of that door. But just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The door stood still, and the house fell silent. For what felt like an eternity, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, Emily approached the door and threw it open. The hallway beyond was empty. Sarah was visibly shaken. We need to get out of here. Now." But Emily was reluctant to leave. Despite the terror she felt, there was something compelling her to stay, something she couldn't quite explain. It was as if the house had a hold on her, refusing to let her go. Sarah left the next morning, unable to shake the feeling of dread that had settled over her during the night. She begged Emily to come with her, to stay at her flat until she could sell the house and move on. But Emily refused. She was determined to figure out what was happening, to find some logical explanation for the events of the past few weeks. That night, alone in the house, Emily decided to confront whatever was haunting her. She went up to the attic, where the air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. The room was empty except for a few old boxes and a single chair in the center, directly under a rafter where a rope had once been tied. As she stood in the center of the attic, the temperature dropped again, and she could see her breath in the air. The door slammed shut behind her, and the room was plunged into darkness. Then, she heard it, the same moan from the night before, but this time it was right next to her ear. She spun around, but there was nothing there. The floorboards creaked, and she felt a cold breath on the back of her neck. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. There was no response, but the air grew heavier, pressing down on her like a weight. She felt a sharp pain in her chest, as if something were squeezing the life out of her. In the dim light, she saw a shadowy figure take shape, tall, with long, thin limbs and hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through her. The figure reached out, its hand closing around her throat. Emily gasped for breath, her vision blurring as the pressure increased. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Just as she was about to lose consciousness, the grip on her throat loosened, and the figure stepped back. It pointed to the rafter above her, and in that moment, Emily understood. The spirit wanted her to join it, to end her life just as Eliza Crawford had done all those years ago. But Emily wasn't ready to give up. Summoning every ounce of strength, she bolted for the door, flinging it open and racing down the stairs. The figure pursued her, its footsteps echoing through the house like a drumbeat. She made it to the front door, flinging it open and bursting out into the cold night air. The moment she crossed the threshold, the presence vanished, and the oppressive weight lifted from her chest. Breathing heavily, Emily turned to look back at the house. The windows were dark, and the door stood ajar, but there was no sign of the shadowy figure. Emily left Bethel Street that night, never to return. She stayed with Sarah until she was able to sell the house, and she never spoke of what happened to anyone, not even her closest friends. But the experience left her changed. She no longer dismissed the stories of spirits and hauntings as mere superstition. The rational, skeptical historian in her had been replaced by someone who had seen the darkness that lurked just beyond the veil of the living world. Emily now believes.
A few years ago, I went to visit my college friend, Delia, at her family's old farmhouse in rural New Hampshire. We hadn't seen each other in a while, and with both of us being busy with our careers, we decided a weekend getaway in the countryside would be the perfect chance to catch up and unwind. The drive up was uneventful. It was late autumn, and the leaves had turned into fiery shades of red and orange, painting the landscape in warm colors. I arrived at the house just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the fields that surrounded the property. The farmhouse itself was charming in a rustic way, with a wraparound porch and a creaky wooden door that led into a cozy living room. Delia greeted me with a hug, and we quickly settled into easy conversation, laughing about old times as she showed me around the house. The place had been in her family for generations, she explained, and it had all the quirks you'd expect from a house that old. Creaking floorboards, drafty windows, and doors that didn't quite close all the way. After dinner, we decided to watch a movie in the living room. Delia's parents were away for the weekend, so it was just the two of us. We popped some popcorn, dimmed the lights, and settled in for a night of horror films, our usual tradition. But about halfway through the movie, I started to feel off. It was nothing I could put my finger on, just a creeping unease that settled in my stomach and made me restless. "Hey, do you feel that?" I asked Delia, trying to laugh off the feeling. "Feel what?" she replied, not taking her eyes off the screen. "I don't know. Like we're being watched?" Delia finally looked over at me, her brow furrowing slightly. "This house can be a bit weird, I guess. It's old, you know? Sometimes it makes noises, but it's nothing to worry about." I nodded, trying to shake off the feeling, but it lingered in the back of my mind like a shadow. We finished the movie, and I tried to forget about it. When it was time to turn in, Delia showed me to the guest room at the end of the hall. It was a quaint room, with an antique bed, floral wallpaper, and a small window that overlooked the fields. The moment I stepped inside, the feeling of unease returned, stronger than before. The air felt thick, like it was pressing down on me, and I shivered despite the warmth of the room. "Are you sure you're okay?" Delia asked, noticing my hesitation. "Yeah, I'm fine," I lied, forcing a smile. "Just tired, I guess." She left me to settle in, and I tried to shake off the sense of dread that had taken hold of me. I changed into my pajamas and climbed into bed, pulling the heavy quilt up to my chin. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, but sleep didn't come easily. The room felt too quiet, too still, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke up suddenly, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was dark, the only light coming from the sliver of moonlight that peeked through the curtains. I lay there, trying to calm my racing heart, when I heard it. A soft, creaking noise, like someone was slowly pushing open a door. I held my breath, listening intently. The sound came again, followed by a faint shuffling, like footsteps. My heart skipped a beat. The door to my room was closed. I was sure of it. I turned my head slowly towards the door, my eyes straining to see in the darkness. For a moment, there was nothing, just the empty room. But then, in the dim light, I saw the door begin to move. It creaked open, just an inch, but enough for me to see that there was no one standing on the other side. A cold dread washed over me as I stared at the door, willing it to stay still. But it didn't. It continued to creak open, inch by inch, until it was fully ajar. I wanted to scream, to call out for Delia, but my voice was trapped in my throat, paralyzed by fear. Then I saw it, a shadowy figure standing in the doorway. It was tall and indistinct, more of a silhouette than a person, but its presence was overwhelming. I could feel its gaze on me, heavy and malevolent. The room seemed to grow colder, and the air felt like it was being sucked out, leaving me gasping for breath. The figure didn't move, just stood there watching me. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying that it would go away, that this was just a nightmare I would wake up from. But when I opened my eyes, it was still there, closer now, hovering at the foot of my bed. I couldn't take it anymore. With a burst of adrenaline, I bolted upright and scrambled out of bed, my heart pounding in my ears. I ran to Delia's room, flinging open the door and nearly tripping over my own feet. "Delia, wake up!" I shouted, shaking her awake. She sat up groggily, rubbing her eyes. "What's wrong?" "There's someone in the house," I cried, my voice trembling. "In my room." Her eyes widened, and she quickly got out of bed, following me back to the guest room. Her eyes widened, and she quickly got out of bed, following me back to the guest room. But when we got there, the room was empty. The door was still ajar, just as I had left it, but there was no sign of the shadowy figure. "I swear, I saw something," I insisted, my voice shaking. "It was standing right there, at the foot of the bed." Delia looked around the room, her expression skeptical. "There's no one here," she said softly, though her own unease was evident. "Maybe it was a nightmare." "No," I shook my head, tears stinging my eyes. "I wasn't asleep. I know what I saw." Delia sighed, glancing around the room once more before finally nodding. "Okay, you can sleep in my room tonight, if that'll make you feel better." I didn't argue. We went back to her room, and I slept on the floor beside her bed, too scared to close my eyes. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I had seen, whatever had been in that room, wasn't gone. The next morning, we decided to leave the house for the day. Delia suggested we take a drive to the nearby town and visit some of the local shops. I agreed, eager to get out of the house and put some distance between myself and the events of the night before. As we drove, I told Delia more about what I had seen, describing the figure in as much detail as I could remember. She listened quietly, her expression thoughtful. "I've never seen anything like that before," she admitted after a long pause. "But there is something I should tell you." I glanced over at her, feeling a chill run down my spine at her tone. "My great-grandfather built that house," she began, her voice low. "And there's a story in the family about him. They say he wasn't a very kind man, that he had a dark side. Some people in town even believed he was involved in some kind of occult practices. My grandmother used to tell me stories when I was little, about how he would spend hours in the basement, doing who knows what. After he died, people started saying the house was haunted, that his spirit never left." I stared at her, my heart pounding. "And you didn't think to tell me this before?" "I didn't think it was real," she said defensively. "I mean, I've lived in that house for years, and I've never seen anything. I thought it was just an old family legend." We drove in silence for a while, both of us lost in our thoughts. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I had seen was connected to her great-grandfather, that his spirit, or whatever was left of it, was still in that house, lingering in the shadows. When we returned to the farmhouse later that day, I was on edge, every creak and groan of the house setting my nerves on fire. Delia suggested we avoid the guest room for the rest of the weekend, and I was more than happy to agree. We spent the rest of the day outside, taking long walks, and trying to distract ourselves from the unsettling events of the previous night. That evening, as the sun began to set, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched again. It was like a weight pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. We had planned to make dinner and watch another movie, but I couldn't bring myself to relax. "I think I should leave," I finally said, my voice trembling. Delia looked at me, concerned. "Are you sure? I mean, it's dark now. Maybe you should stay just one more night and leave in the morning?" But I couldn't bear the thought of spending another night in that house. I insisted on leaving, and eventually, Delia relented. She helped me pack up my things, and we said our goodbyes quickly, the both of us eager to part ways. As I drove away from the farmhouse, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that shadowy figure standing in the road behind me. But there was nothing, just the empty, winding road disappearing into the darkness. It wasn't until I was miles away, back on the main highway, that I finally began to feel the tension ease from my body. The further I got from Delia's house, the more I felt like I could breathe again, as if a heavy weight had been lifted off my chest. I made it home without incident, and for a while, I tried to forget about what had happened at the farmhouse. But the memory of that night stayed with me, haunting my thoughts whenever I was alone. I couldn't help but wonder if I had really seen something supernatural, or if my mind had simply played tricks on me in the unfamiliar surroundings of that old house. A few weeks later, Delia called me. She sounded different, her usual light-hearted tone replaced with something more serious. "I wanted to let you know," she began, "that I went back to the guest room. I wanted to prove to myself that there was nothing there, that it was all just in our heads." My heart skipped a beat. "And?" "There was something off about it," she admitted. "I felt it as soon as I walked in. The air was heavy, like it was thick with something I couldn't see. I was alone, but I felt like I wasn't." A chill ran down my spine as I listened to her. "I called in someone," she continued, hesitating slightly. A medium, I guess you'd call her. She came in, and as soon as she stepped into the house, she told me there was something wrong. She said there was a presence there, an old, angry spirit, something that had been tied to the house for a long time. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to dismiss it, to say that mediums weren't real, that it was all just a trick. But deep down, I knew she was telling the truth. "The medium performed a cleansing ritual," Delia said, her voice growing softer. "She said it would help, that it would let whatever was there move on. I don't know if it worked, but the house feels different now, lighter." I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. "So, it's gone? Whatever it was?" "I think so," she replied, and I could hear the relief in her voice. "The house feels like it used to, like it's just a house again. But I don't think I'll ever forget what happened." "Neither will I," said quietly. We talked for a little while longer, and by the end of the call, I could feel my body completely relaxed. In the weeks that followed, I found myself slowly returning to normal. The memory of that night at the farmhouse became just that, a memory. Whatever had been in Delia's house was gone, and I was safe.
When we found our dream house on Hollow Hill, it seemed perfect, an old but charming colonial nestled away from the hustle and bustle of city life. The realtor had mentioned that it had been on the market for a while, but no one had ever given us a clear reason why. We were eager to move in and start a new chapter, so we brushed off the oddities and proceeded with the purchase. The first sign that something was amiss came just a few days after we moved in. My husband, Mark, was busy unpacking boxes in the attic while I tried to make the house feel more like home. Our 2 children, Emma and Jake, were excitedly exploring their new rooms. It wasn't until later that evening that we started to notice peculiar occurrences. As the sun set and the house grew dark, Emma complained of hearing whispers in her room. At first, I thought it was just the sound of the wind moving through the old wooden beams. I reassured her that it was nothing to worry about and tucked her into bed. However, as I turned off her light, I noticed a faint glow coming from the attic stairs. It was an eerie, unnatural light, soft and bluish. When I asked Mark about it, he shrugged it off, saying it was probably just a reflection from one of the old windows in the attic. He was always the practical one, and I tried to follow his lead. That night, however, Emma's whispers grew louder, and I heard scratching sounds from the walls that I couldn't ignore. The next day, Mark decided to tackle the attic and check the wiring, thinking maybe it was an electrical issue causing the strange lights. As he climbed up, Emma and Jake and I stayed downstairs, trying to adjust to the house. I was preparing dinner when I heard what sounded like footsteps above us, despite Mark's assurance that no one was up there. Later that week, while Mark was away at work, I found a series of old photographs in the attic. They were faded and yellowed, showing various people I didn't recognize, some looking out from the house's windows, others posed in front of what was clearly our home, but with different architectural features. A couple of the photos had a peculiar quality about them, like someone had been purposely scratched out of the image. I tried to show Mark, but he dismissed it as remnants of the house's long history. Weeks passed, and the incidents grew more frequent and disturbing. I would find objects moved from their places, and our dog, Max, began barking at unseen things in the corners of the rooms. Emma started to have vivid nightmares, screaming about shadowy figures that watched her from the dark. Mark remained skeptical until one evening, when something happened that changed his mind but slightly. It was late when Mark came home from work, visibly exhausted. I had put the children to bed and was sitting in the living room when I heard him shouting from the attic. I rushed up to find him pale and trembling. He explained that he had seen a shadowy figure moving in the attic, one that seemed to dart behind the old beams and disappear when he tried to follow it. He was convinced it was an intruder until he saw the figure's eyes, cold, glowing, and empty. Mark, though shaken, but his experience was not enough to shake his skepticism. The next night, while we were having dinner, the lights flickered erratically, and the temperature dropped suddenly. I could see our breath misting in the dining room. Emma and Jake, frightened by the sudden chill, clung to us, their faces pale with fear. Mark tried to stay calm, but his eyes darted around the room as if expecting something to appear. Later, Mark went to the attic again to check for any possible causes for the cold air. As he climbed the stairs, I realized after some minutes that no sound was coming from the attic. I called out to him but no response. I went up after him, and what I found was chilling. Mark stood in the middle of the attic, staring at an old mirror leaning against the wall. It was as though he was mesmerized by something in its reflection. I called his name repeatedly, but he didn't respond. When I touched his shoulder, he snapped out of his trance, his face drained of color. He didn't say much, but I could see the fear in his eyes. That night, Mark came to me with a decision: he wanted to leave. Despite the moving expenses and the fact that we had only just begun to settle in, he insisted we pack up and find somewhere else to live. I was initially hesitant but understood his resolve when I saw the terror that had overtaken him. We packed up the house as quickly as we could. Our departure felt rushed and frantic, with the eerie sensations of the house growing stronger as we neared the end. On our last night, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if the house itself was resisting our leaving. For the next few months, we moved into my parents' house while we searched for a new place. The temporary relocation was unsettling, but it was a welcome reprieve from the oppressive atmosphere of Hollow Hill. My parents were understanding. I told them everything we experienced and they were quite shocked. Eventually, we found a new house not too far from Hollow Hill. It was a modest, cozy place, and though it lacked the grandeur of our former home, it felt like a sanctuary compared to the unsettling memories of our previous residence. After we moved out, I couldn't help but wonder about the house on Hollow Hill. It still stood there, vacant and forlorn. I made several attempts to speak with the neighbors, hoping to uncover some history or explanation for the house's disturbing behavior. However, none of them had lived there for more than a few years. Those that did seemed to avoid the topic. Despite my inquiries, I found no concrete answers. The house remains an enigma, its dark windows staring out at the world with a haunting emptiness. To this day, as we pass by Hollow Hill, I can't help but glance at the house, wondering what secrets it might still be hiding. I wasn't supposed to close that night. I had switched shifts with Greg so he could go to his girlfriend's birthday party, and it ended up being a longer day than I expected. By the time I locked up the shop, it was already pushing midnight, and I knew I was going to miss the last bus. I cursed under my breath as I jogged to the bus stop on Main Street, just in time to see the taillights of the number 8 disappear around the corner. Perfect. Just perfect. The next bus wouldn't come until morning, and I wasn't about to blow my money on a cab. The walk home was a little over 2 miles, not too bad, but the streets in Stillwater, especially at this hour, could feel a lot longer. I checked my phone. 12:08 a.m. There were a few texts from friends, but I didn't bother responding. I just wanted to get home, kick off my shoes, and collapse into bed. I pulled up my hoodie, shoved my hands into my pockets, and started the trek down Washington Avenue. The town was quiet, which was expected this late. The only sounds were the occasional hum of a car in the distance, the rustling of leaves, and the steady rhythm of my footsteps. The streetlights cast long shadows, warping the familiar sidewalks into something that felt foreign and eerie. I'd walked this route 100 times before, but something about tonight felt off. I told myself it was just my tired mind playing tricks, but the unease gnawed at me as I moved forward. The houses along the street looked darker, more dilapidated than I remembered, and the air was thick with a strange, almost metallic scent. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the destination. All I had to do was keep walking. My apartment was on Pine Street, just past the old church. I picked up my pace. As I turned onto Birch Road, the streetlights flickered and then, one by one, went out. I froze. There was nothing but darkness ahead, and for a moment, I considered doubling back to Main Street. But the thought of adding more time to my walk convinced me otherwise. It was just a power outage, I reasoned. No big deal. I still had my phone's flashlight. I pulled it out and clicked it on. The narrow beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the pavement directly in front of me. I forced myself to keep moving, one step at a time. The farther I went, the more the silence deepened, swallowing up even the faintest of sounds. No cars, no wind, nothing. It was like the world had gone mute, and the only noise left was my own breathing, which was coming faster now. Then I saw her. At first, I thought it was just a shadow cast by my light, but as I got closer, I realized it was a woman standing by the side of the road. She was facing away from me, her long, dark hair hanging loose down her back, almost reaching her waist. She wore a white dress, dirty and torn, that looked like it belonged in another era. I slowed my pace, not wanting to startle her. Maybe she needed help, but there was something about her that made me hesitate. She didn't seem to be moving at all, just standing there, unnaturally still. My heart thudded in my chest, a steady drumbeat of fear that grew louder with each step. "Excuse me, ma'am." I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the oppressive silence. She didn't respond. She didn't even turn around. "Ma'am, are you all right?" I tried again, inching closer. And then, she moved, just slightly. Her head turned, not enough for me to see her face, but just enough to let me know she'd heard me. Every instinct screamed at me to stop, to turn around and run, but my legs kept moving. I was close now, close enough to reach out and touch her if I dared. I didn't. She took a step forward, away from me, and then another, her bare feet making no sound on the pavement. I shone the light on her, trying to see her face, but it was like the darkness clung to her, refusing to let go. And then she spoke, in a voice that was barely a whisper, yet cut through the silence like a knife. "Follow me." I didn't want to. God, I didn't want to, but my legs moved on their own, drawn to her like a magnet. She began to walk, slowly at first, but then faster, and I followed, the beam of my flashlight bouncing erratically as I struggled to keep up. She led me off Birch Road, down a narrow alleyway I'd never noticed before. The walls were lined with graffiti and garbage, but I barely noticed. All I could focus on was the figure in white ahead of me, slipping further and further into the darkness. "Where are we going?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted an answer. She didn't reply, just kept moving, her pace quickening until she was almost running. My heart pounded in my ears, and I nearly lost sight of her as she turned a corner into another alley, narrower and darker than the last. I rounded the corner, expecting to see her just ahead, but the alley was empty. She was gone. I stopped, shining my light in every direction. There was no way she could have disappeared so quickly. The alley was a dead end, with high brick walls on 3 sides. I was alone. I should have been relieved, but instead, a cold dread settled over me. I turned back the way I came, ready to leave this nightmare behind, but the alley seemed to stretch on forever. The walls closed in, the darkness pressing down on me like a physical weight. I walked faster, then broke into a run, but no matter how far I went, I couldn't find the way out. My breath came in ragged gasps, my chest tight with panic. The air grew colder, and that metallic scent I'd noticed earlier was back, stronger than before. It filled my nostrils, making me gag. I was trapped. I don't know how long I ran, but it felt like hours. Eventually, I stumbled, falling to my knees in the middle of the alley. My phone slipped from my hand, the light flickering and then dying, plunging me into complete darkness. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural whisper, echoing off the walls, surrounding me. "Why did you stop?" My blood ran cold. I looked around, but there was nothing, just shadows that seemed to shift and writhe like living things. "You shouldn't have stopped," the voice rasped, closer now, so close I could feel its breath on the back of my neck. I scrambled to my feet, but something grabbed me, cold, bony fingers wrapping around my ankle, pulling me down. I kicked out, my foot connecting with something solid, and the grip loosened just enough for me to break free. I didn't look back. I just ran, not caring where I was going, just needing to escape. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it was over. I burst out of the alley and onto Pine Street, the streetlights glowing softly, the night air warm and familiar. I was back. I stood there, gasping for breath, my heart racing as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. The alley was behind me, but when I turned to look, it was gone. Just a solid wall of brick, with no sign of an entrance. I walked home in a daze, too shaken to process it all. When I finally got to my apartment, I locked the door behind me and collapsed onto my bed, not bothering to undress. Sleep didn't come easy that night, and when it did, it was filled with nightmares, of the woman, of the alley, of the voice. The next day, I went back to Birch Road, back to where I'd seen the woman. I had to know if it was real, if any of it was real. But there was nothing. No alley, no woman, nothing. I told myself it was just a bad dream, a trick of the mind brought on by exhaustion. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying in bed, I can still hear that voice, low and guttural, echoing in my ears. "Why did you stop?" "I don't walk home anymore." I take the bus, no matter how late it is. And I never, ever take Birch Road. When I was about 15, my family moved into an old house on the outskirts of a small town in rural Pennsylvania. The house had been vacant for several years, and the smell of dust and stale air hit us as soon as we stepped inside. It was the kind of place you could tell had a history, though no one in town ever really explained what kind. Built in the late 1800s, it had the look of a home that had seen better days, with creaky floorboards and faded wallpaper that peeled at the edges. From the first night, I noticed something wasn't quite right. My room was on the second floor, down a long hallway from my parents' bedroom. It was small, with just enough space for my bed, a dresser, and a desk. The window overlooked the backyard, which was overgrown with weeds and shadowed by a few gnarled trees. A few days after we moved in, I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, when I heard footsteps in the hallway. They were soft, almost hesitant, like someone trying not to be heard. Thinking it was my mom or dad checking on me, I called out, "Mom? Dad?" The footsteps stopped. I waited, but there was no response. After a minute or two, I got up and opened the door to look into the hallway. It was empty. I figured I must have imagined it, so I shrugged it off and went back to bed. But that wasn't the end of it. Over the next few weeks, strange things started happening. I'd find my books moved around, sometimes stacked in odd places. Doors that I was sure I'd closed would be slightly ajar when I turned back. I also had this constant feeling that I was being watched, especially when I was alone in my room at night. The most unsettling thing, though, were the cold spots. Out of nowhere, I'd walk into an area of the house and feel the temperature drop so sharply that it made me shiver. My parents wrote it off as drafts in an old house, but something about it felt different, more intentional. One night, I woke up to a faint humming sound. It was coming from near the window. Groggy, I sat up and squinted through the darkness, but I didn't see anything unusual. The humming continued, soft and almost soothing, like a lullaby. I didn't mention it to anyone the next morning, convincing myself that it must have been the wind from my half-asleep mind playing tricks on me. Then, one evening, my mom was alone in the kitchen, washing dishes, when she felt a sudden coldness on her shoulder, like someone had placed an ice-cold hand there. She turned around quickly, but no one was there. She brushed it off, but I could tell it left her uneasy. My dad, who was always the skeptic, began to experience things too. Late at night, he'd hear what he described as faint whispers, barely audible but just loud enough to make him stop and listen. He tried to ignore it, but one night while working in his study, he heard the whispers more clearly, as if they were coming from just outside the door. When he opened it, the hallway was empty. The tension in the house was becoming unbearable. My dad, usually the rational one, started sleeping with a baseball bat by the bed, convinced that someone was sneaking around the house at night. My mom began praying more often, her hands trembling as she clutched her rosary. They stopped dismissing the strange occurrences as drafts or imagination, and we all began tiptoeing around the house, as if trying not to disturb something that was always just out of sight. The tipping point came one night and my mom saw something in my room. She had come upstairs to check on me, thinking I was asleep. As she passed by my room, she noticed something out of the corner of her eye, something by the window. She froze, staring at the silhouette of what looked like a woman, standing still and facing the window. My mom didn't wait to get a closer look. She hurried downstairs, visibly shaken. The next morning, she and my dad decided we needed to move. They didn't explain much, just said that the house wasn't a good fit for us. I didn't argue. I was relieved to leave. While packing up, my dad discovered something odd in the basement. Behind a loose brick in the wall, he found an old photograph tucked away. It was faded and yellowed with age, showing a young woman standing in front of our house, dressed in a long gown. When my mom showed it to our elderly neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, She went pale and whispered, "That's Eliza. She lived in that house a long time ago. Lost her husband and child to illness, poor soul." After hearing that, everything made more sense, though it didn't make us feel any better. My parents sold the house quickly, not caring about the loss. As we drove away for the last time, none of us looked back. A few months later, out of curiosity, I asked my dad if the new owners had ever mentioned anything strange about the house. He just shook his head and said they never heard from them. Dad said he wasn't interested in finding out if they experienced anything strange. For a long time after, I would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, feeling uneasy, as if the memories of that house had followed us. But I'd shake it off, reminding myself that we were miles away from that place, and whatever was there, was now someone else's problem. There's something unsettling about running in the woods as the sun sets. The light fades in increments, shadows stretch out and intertwine, and the forest, once alive with the calls of birds and rustling leaves, begins to take on an ominous silence. It's the sort of quiet that presses in, like the woods are holding their breath, waiting. That's where my friend Matt and I found ourselves on a late autumn evening. We'd made a habit of running through the forest trails near our small town. The paths wound deep into the woods, far enough that the sounds of civilization were nothing more than a faint memory. It was usually a peaceful experience, just the two of us, the rhythm of our feet pounding the dirt, and the crisp air filling our lungs. But that evening was different. We set off later than usual. By the time we hit the trailhead, the sun was already a deep orange on the horizon, sinking fast. I glanced at Matt. "Maybe we should stick to the shorter loop tonight." He shrugged, not bothered. "We'll be fine. Besides, the long loop's better. You get a real sense of distance. And the endorphins, man." He grinned, always the one to push the envelope a bit further. Reluctantly, I agreed, and we jogged into the forest. The trail was narrow, lined with tall pines and thick underbrush. I could hear the crunch of leaves underfoot, the rhythmic inhale and exhale of our breaths. But as we got deeper into the woods, something felt off. The usual sounds of the forest, bird calls, squirrels scurrying, wind whispering through the trees, were gone. It was like the forest had gone mute, leaving only the echo of our footfalls. "Do you hear that?" I asked, slowing down. Matt shot me a look, his breath coming in puffs. "Hear what?" "Nothing," I replied. "That's the problem." We stopped, both of us listening. The air was thick, still. It felt like the forest was watching us, waiting for something. Then, from deeper in the woods, there came a sound, a low, rhythmic thumping, like something heavy being dropped over and over again. "What the hell is that?" Matt muttered, squinting into the gathering darkness. I shook my head, unease crawling up my spine. "Maybe we should head back." He hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, maybe." We turned back the way we came, but the forest seemed different, somehow. The path that had been clear and familiar now twisted unnervingly, the trees pressing in closer. The air was colder, too, carrying with it a scent I couldn't place, something earthy and rotten, like the ground itself was decaying. We picked up our pace, our earlier bravado fading. The sky above was a deep purple now, the last light of day bleeding away. And then, the sound came again, closer this time. A steady, rhythmic thump, 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 like footsteps, but not quite. Something was following us. "Let's run," I said, my voice tight with fear. We broke into a sprint, our feet pounding the dirt, our breaths ragged. The sound followed, relentless, growing louder with every step. I didn't dare look back, I didn't want to see what was behind us. The only thing I could think was to get out, to get back to the safety of the town. But no matter how fast we ran, the sound was always there, matching our pace. And then, without warning, Matt screamed, a guttural, terrified sound that ripped through the silence. I skidded to a halt and spun around. Matt was standing in the middle of the trail, his eyes wide with horror, staring at something in the trees. I followed his gaze, and what I saw made my blood run cold. There, just beyond the edge of the trail, was a figure, tall, thin, its limbs unnaturally long, fingers like twisted branches. Its eyes, if you could call them that, were deep pits of darkness, empty voids that seemed to swallow the light. It didn't move, just stood there, watching us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Matt, we have to go," I shouted, but he didn't move. He was frozen, rooted to the spot as if in a trance. I grabbed his arm and yanked, hard. He snapped out of it, his eyes flicking to me, wild with fear. Without a word, we both took off again, running faster than I thought possible. But the thing in the woods didn't follow us, at least, not in the way something physical would. Instead, the forest itself seemed to shift around us, the trees warping and twisting, the path branching into impossible directions. It was like the woods were alive, trying to trap us, pull us deeper into its heart. The thumping sound was gone, replaced by something worse, a whispering, like voices carried on the wind, just at the edge of hearing. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but they filled my mind with a deep, primal fear. We were not alone. Finally, after what felt like hours, we burst out of the tree line and into the open air. The lights of the town were visible in the distance, a beacon of safety. We didn't stop running until we were back on the main road, our legs burning, lungs screaming for air. We slowed to a walk, both of us panting, drenched in sweat. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The normal sounds of the evening, cars in the distance, the faint hum of streetlights, felt surreal, like we had stepped back into the world after being somewhere else, somewhere wrong. "What the hell was that?" Matt finally said, his voice shaky. "I don't know," I replied, my heart still pounding. "But whatever it wasn't human." He nodded, rubbing his arms as if to shake off the lingering chill. "I don't think we should go back there." Agreed. We walked the rest of the way in silence, both of us lost in our thoughts. The town, once so familiar and safe, now felt strange, alien. The encounter in the woods had changed something, like a veil had been lifted, revealing a world beneath, a world that didn't follow the rules we knew. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure in the woods, those empty eyes staring into me, through me. I tried to rationalize it, tell myself it was just a trick of the light, our imaginations running wild. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The next day, Matt and I talked about it again, trying to piece together what had happened. We considered telling someone, but who would believe us? Two guys out for a run, seeing monsters in the woods. It sounded ridiculous. So we kept it to ourselves, but we never went back to that trail. And slowly, the memory faded, becoming something we didn't talk about, a shared secret that lingered in the back of our minds. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I hear that sound, the low, rhythmic thumping, and I wonder if we really escaped that night, or if a part of us is still out there in the woods, lost in that twisted place where the world is not as it seems. Thank you so much for watching and supporting my channel. Your time and engagement mean the world to me. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more content. And be sure to hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Your support keeps this channel going, and I truly appreciate each and every one of you. Thank you.